They called you too intense, too emotional, too needy. But the truth, you were carrying the emotional weight of two people while they kept one foot outside the relationship the entire time. And one day, something inside you snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. You stopped explaining your pain to someone committed to misunderstanding it. You stopped trying to decode cold replies, chase mixed signals, beg for clarity from someone addicted to actually leave. That's the hidden assumption beneath almost every avoidant dynamic. Not because they're evil, not because they consciously sit there planning to hurt you, but because somewhere deep inside them, they learned that intimacy is something to control before it controls them. So they keep people close enough to receive love, but never close enough to fully surrender to it. And when you're the anxious, loyal, emotionally available one in that relationship, you slowly become conditioned to survive on emotional instability. At first, you don't even notice it happening. You call it understanding their space. You call it being patient. You call it fighting for the relationship. But over time, your entire emotional world starts revolving around their distance. You begin measuring your worth by their responsiveness. A delayed text ruins your mood. A cold tone makes your chest tighten. A sudden moment of affection feels euphoric because your nervous system has been starving for reassurance for so long. That's the trap. The relationship stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like emotional weather. And every day you wake up wondering which version of them you're going to get. The warm version, the detached version, the disappearing version. The version that looks at you with love one week and acts emotionally numb the next. And because you love deeply, you convince yourself that if you can just say the right thing, understand them enough, support them enough, heal them enough, eventually they'll stop running from intimacy. So you overextend. You become the therapist instead of the partner. You become hyper-aware of their moods. You rehearse conversations in your head before saying them because you're afraid honesty will push them away. You carry the emotional labor of the entire relationship while pretending it doesn't exhaust you. And the terrifying part is, you slowly abandon yourself while trying to keep the relationship alive. You stop expressing needs because they seem overwhelmed by them. You tolerate inconsistency because you remember their good side. You shrink your emotions so they don't feel pressured. Until one day you realize something painful. You've been teaching someone how to receive love from you without fully showing up for you. That realization changes a person, because eventually exhaustion replaces hope. Not suddenly, silently. It happens in tiny moments. The night you cry alone while they emotionally shut down again. The moment you realize they only become affectionate after you start pulling away. The realization that you've spent months trying to explain basic emotional needs to someone who hears vulnerability as criticism. And eventually something inside you stops reaching. That's the moment they never expect. They expect your anger. They expect your emotional messages. They expect you to chase, explain, overanalyze, return. But they are completely unprepared for emotional detachment. Because when you genuinely stop trying to fix them, the dynamic loses its center of gravity. Your pursuit was the glue holding everything together. Your overthinking kept the connection alive. Your emotional labor filled in the gaps they refused to fill. Your constant reassurance protected them from consequences. But once your energy disappears, reality arrives. Now they wake up and notice the silence. The absence of your long paragraphs. The missing affection. The emotional warmth they thought would always be available no matter how distant they became. And here's the brutal truth about avoidant people. Many of them suppress emotion while connection feels secure. As long as they believe you'll stay, they can emotionally compartmentalize you. They can focus on distractions, routines, work, independence, avoidance. But uncertainty activates emotions they buried. The moment they feel they may have truly lost you, the emotional walls begin cracking. Suddenly memories flood in. The way you listened to them. The way you stayed patient during their shutdowns. The safety you created for them emotionally. The loyalty they quietly depended on while pretending not to need anyone. Now your absence becomes emotional contrast, and contrast creates clarity. That's why many avoidants don't process the breakup immediately. Sometimes it hits weeks later, sometimes months later. Because delayed emotional processing is common when someone has spent years disconnecting from vulnerability. At first, they feel relief, freedom, space. But eventually the distractions fade, and what remains is the emotional residue of losing someone who genuinely cared. That's when regret enters quietly. Not always dramatic regret, not always begging. Sometimes it's subtle. They stalk your social media at night, reread old conversations, compare new people to you, feel strangely empty in situations they thought would make them happier. Because what they lost wasn't just attention, they lost on-air safety. And emotional safety is rare, especially for people who spent their lives avoiding intimacy while secretly craving it. You see, avoidants often believe closeness will trap them. So when love becomes deep, their nervous system interprets connection as danger. They pull away to regain control. Distance becomes their coping mechanism. But eventually they discover something painful. Distance also destroys the very thing they were searching for: connection. And by the time they realize it, the person who loved them has usually transformed. That's the part nobody prepares them for. Because when you stop obsessing over fixing someone else, you finally begin rebuilding yourself. You start reconnecting with your own identity, your own peace, your own emotional stability. And slowly, the version of you that once begged for crumbs becomes someone unrecognizable, calmer, stronger, more grounded. Not because the pain didn't affect you, because it forced you to evolve. And ironically, evolution often makes you more attractive to the very person who emotionally neglected you. Not because they suddenly became emotionally healthy, but because your withdrawal removed access. Humans often fail to value what feels permanently available. And when your energy disappears for real, people finally confront its importance. That's why becoming the one that got away is never about manipulation. It's not pretending not to care. It's not fake silence. It's not revenge. It's what naturally happens when someone keeps taking your love for granted until one day, there's nothing left to chase. And the haunting part for them is this: they usually don't miss you at your weakest. They miss you when they realize you stop needing them to validate your worth. Because that's when your love stops looking desperate and starts looking irreplaceable. Your healing becomes impossible for them to ignore. Not because you post quotes online, not because you try to make them jealous, but because, see, real healing changes your energy in ways people can feel before you even speak. When you've spent months or years emotionally attached to an avoidant person, your nervous system adapts to instability without you realizing it. You become hyperalert. Your mind constantly scans for emotional danger. You reread messages searching for hidden meaning. You overanalyze pauses in conversation. You lose sleep trying to understand someone who refuses to fully communicate what they feel. And the exhausting part is that you start believing this emotional chaos is love. You mistake anxiety for passion, confusion for chemistry, emotional inconsistency for depth. Because when someone gives affection unpredictably, your brain becomes addicted to the emotional highs and lows. The rare moments of closeness feel intoxicating precisely because they are scarce. So you chase those moments. You tolerate emotional distance because you're addicted to the possibility of connection returning. And slowly you lose connection with yourself. Your hobbies fade. Your confidence weakens. Your emotional world revolves around whether they are emotionally available that day. That's why healing after an avoidant relationship feels so strange at first. Because you're not just grieving a person, you're withdrawing from emotional addiction. At the beginning, silence feels unbearable. You check your phone constantly. Your body craves reassurance. Your mind romanticizes memories while conveniently forgetting the pain. But something incredible begins happening when you stop chasing. Your nervous system starts stabilizing. The constant emotional adrenaline fades. Your sleep improves. Your thoughts become clearer. You stop waking up every morning wondering whether someone else's mood will determine your self-worth. And that shift changes your entire presence. You walk differently. There's less desperation in your energy, less fear in your voice, less emotional urgency behind every interaction. People can feel when someone stops abandoning themselves. That's what becomes magnetic, because confidence is not loudness. Real confidence is emotional steadiness. It's the ability to remain grounded without needing constant validation from someone emotionally inconsistent. And here's where the dynamic completely flips. The avoidant person who once felt overwhelmed by your emotional intensity suddenly notices your absence emotionally, not just physically, energetically. Because your pursuit once gave them emotional certainty. They knew you would stay. They knew you would explain yourself repeatedly. They knew you would keep trying to reconnect no matter how disconnected they became. Your effort protected them from loss, but now you're healing. Now your energy is no longer focused on rescuing them. And that creates something deeply uncomfortable for avoidance, reflection, because your healing removes the distraction they once relied on. When you were chasing them, they could focus on your emotions, your reactions, your needs, your attempts to reconnect. But now there's silence, and silence forces self-confrontation. Suddenly, they begin noticing patterns they once ignored. How many people they pushed away. How often they confused independence with emotional avoidance. How many genuine connections they sabotaged because vulnerability terrified them. Your growth becomes evidence. Evidence that the relationship wasn't failing because you were too much. It failed because intimacy required emotional presence they were not ready to sustain. And deep down they know it. That's why avoidants often reappear once they sense emotional distance from you. Not always consciously, not always manipulatively. Sometimes they genuinely feel the loss. Because your healing disrupts the story they told themselves. The story that you would always wait, always chase, always remain emotionally available no matter how little they invested. But now you're evolving beyond the version they knew. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop interpreting emotional unavailability as mystery. You stop seeing breadcrumbs as love. And once that happens, your standards rise naturally. Not from bitterness, from clarity. That clarity changes your face, your posture, your conversations, your boundaries. You no longer tolerate emotional confusion because peace has become more valuable than emotional chaos. That transformation is powerful because it's authentic. You're no longer trying to win the breakup. You're reclaiming yourself. And ironically, that's often when the avoidant person becomes emotionally curious again. Because emotionally unavailable people are often most drawn to what feels emotionally safe yet no longer accessible. Now they wonder about you, who you've become, whether you still think about them, whether someone else is receiving the emotional warmth they once had access to. And what truly unsettles them is realizing your love was real, not performative, not superficial, real. You genuinely saw them deeply. You genuinely tried to understand them. You genuinely offered emotional safety, and now that safety is gone. That realization can haunt someone, because emotionally avoidant people often discover too late that authentic love is difficult to replace. Surface-level attraction is easy to find. Attention is easy to find. Distraction is easy to find. But someone who truly stayed patient with their fears, someone who tried to understand the parts they hid from the world, that's rare. And when they see you thriving without them, the loss becomes undeniable. Not because your life became perfect, but because your energy no longer carries emotional dependency. You become calmer, more selective, more emotionally centered. And that version of you forces them to confront an uncomfortable truth. You were never the problem they convinced themselves you were. You were simply asking for intimacy from someone afraid of what intimacy demanded. Presence, consistency, on accountability. And once you stop trying to drag someone toward emotional growth they refuse to choose themselves, your entire life begins changing. Because healing redirects energy. The energy once spent overthinking them now builds you. Your confidence sharpens. Your boundaries strengthen. Your self-respect deepens. And eventually, you reach a place where you no longer need them to return in order to feel whole. That's the moment your power fully returns. Not when they text you, not when they regret losing you, when their choices no longer define your value. The person who walks away with dignity changes the entire story. Most people think power after heartbreak comes from revenge, making them jealous, ignoring them strategically, pretending not to care. But real power feels different. It's quieter. It's the moment you stop trying to convince someone to love you correctly. That shift is life-changing because when you've loved an avoidant partner for a long time, you often lose yourself. Ourself inside the pursuit of emotional certainty. You become obsessed with solving the relationship. You analyze every conversation, every emotional withdrawal, every inconsistency. You spend hours trying to understand why someone who clearly feels something for you can also act emotionally distant at the exact same time. And because human beings naturally search for meaning, you eventually start blaming yourself. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I ask for too much. Maybe if I were calmer, prettier, less sensitive, they would finally stop pulling away. That internal dialogue destroys people slowly, because you begin treating love like something you must earn through performance. You become more patient than you really feel, more understanding than is healthy, more forgiving than your nervous system can handle. And meanwhile, your self-worth becomes dependent on whether someone emotionally unavailable chooses you consistently. That's emotional starvation, and starving people accept crumbs they would normally reject. A late-night text suddenly feels meaningful. Basic affection feels extraordinary. Temporary closeness feels like proof the relationship is finally changing. But eventually reality catches up. You realize you're exhausted, not because you love too deeply, because you kept pouring emotional energy into someone unwilling or unable to meet you halfway. And there comes a moment in every painful relationship where your soul quietly asks, how much longer are you going to abandon yourself hoping someone else finally sees your value? That question changes everything, because once self-respect awakens, the illusion starts collapsing. You begin seeing the relationship clearly instead of emotionally. You stop romanticizing potential. Stop falling in love with occasional vulnerability while ignoring consistent emotional absence. Stop interpreting inconsistency as complexity. And suddenly, things that once confused you become obvious. You realize emotionally healthy love does not leave you constantly anxious. You realize connection should not feel like emotional survival. You realize people who genuinely value you do not repeatedly force you to question where you stand. That clarity is painful at first, because it means grieving not only the person but the fantasy. The fantasy that one day they would wake up transformed. That your patience would finally unlock their emotional walls, that your loyalty would eventually make them feel safe enough to love fully. Letting go of that fantasy feels like mourning a future that never truly existed, but it also liberates you, because now you stop chasing validation from someone emotionally unavailable to give it consistently. And this is where dignity enters. Dignity is not coldness, it's self-respect in motion. It's choosing not to beg for reciprocity anymore. It's refusing to keep proving your worth to someone committed to emotional distance. It's understanding that love should expand your identity, not erase it. And when someone walks away with dignity, something psychologically powerful happens. They interrupt the dynamic completely. Avoidant relationships often survive because one person keeps emotionally pursuing while the other keeps distancing. That cycle creates emotional momentum. But dignity breaks the cycle. Now there are no dramatic emotional chases, no desperate attempts to reconnect, no endless explanations trying to force emotional understanding. Just silence, boundaries, self-respect, and that silence speaks loudly. Because people remember the ones who loved deeply without becoming cruel, the ones who walked away without destroying themselves or seeking revenge. That kind of emotional maturity becomes unforgettable. Especially to emotionally avoidant people. Why? Because avoidants are often accustomed to emotional chaos. They expect anger, clinging, emotional explosions, repeated attempts to reconnect. But when someone leaves peacefully and genuinely begins rebuilding their life, it creates emotional dissonance. Now they can't label you crazy. They can't dismiss your pain as irrational. They can't avoid the reality that they lost someone emotionally genuine. And over time, dignity ages beautifully. While emotional games fade quickly, self-respect leaves permanent impressions. Months later, people rarely remember the arguments clearly, but they remember how you made them feel. They remember your warmth, your patience, your emotional safety. And if they lose access to that because they failed to value it properly, the absence lingers, especially when they encounter superficial relationships afterward. Because once someone experiences authentic emotional depth, shallow connections feel empty by comparison. That's why many avoidants circle back emotionally long after the relationship ends. Not always physically, sometimes emotionally. You remain in their memory because your love represented something real they were not emotionally prepared to sustain. And by the time they understand your value fully, you've usually changed. You no longer need their recognition to validate your worth. That's the ultimate transformation. Because true healing is not becoming emotionally numb. It's becoming emotionally selective. You stop giving unlimited access to people who repeatedly mishandle your heart. You stop trying to rescue emotionally unavailable partners from consequences. You stop confusing suffering with devotion. And eventually, you become someone who values peace more than emotional intensity. That energy is rare. Grounded people are rare. Emotionally secure people are rare. People who can love deeply without abandoning themselves are rare. And when you become that person, you naturally become unforgettable. Not because you tried to, because authenticity leaves marks on people, especially in a world filled with emotional inconsistency. So the real victory was never getting them back. The real victory was becoming someone who no longer loved. They themselves are trying to save people who refuse to face their own emotional wounds. That's what changes your entire future, because now you no longer chase love that feels unstable. You recognize your value earlier. You leave unhealthy dynamics sooner. You trust your intuition instead of overriding it for potential. And the version of you that once begged for clarity becomes someone who radiates it naturally. That transformation is powerful, because the person who finally chooses themselves after years of emotional neglect doesn't just heal, they become impossible to forget.